Addison Mizner never earned an architecture degree. In roughly a decade, that untrained hand would design 67 buildings in Palm Beach and 27 more in a place called Boca Raton. But when sales opened in 1925, Boca Raton was nothing but lines on a survey map. That morning, his company sold lot after lot across 1,600 acres of that coastline, 2 miles of it fronting open ocean, and buyers signed for more than $2 million in house lots on a canal that had not been dug and gondolas that did not exist, marked only by survey stakes in the sand. By October, the paper total reached $25 million. That fortune would not last. His own brother, a Broadway playwright with a gift for the con, was coming east to help sell the dream. The one building Mizner finished would outlast every promise he broke. The company would be sold off for a fraction of what it earned that single morning, and on a quiet Palm Beach street, a small grave would outlast all of it. Chapter 1. The Architect Who Never Trained. No school in California, or anywhere else, ever handed Mizner a professional credential, and by the end of this story that absence will matter more than any diploma could have. He was born in Benicia, California, on the 12th of December, 1872, at the far edge of a country still filling itself in. Nothing about that birthplace pointed toward Florida, or toward architecture, or toward any single trade at all. What it pointed toward was motion. At 17, he was in Guatemala. By 21, he had worked his way to China. Neither trip taught him a single rule of architecture, but both taught him something a classroom never could, that a man could walk into an unfamiliar country with nothing but nerve and come out having learned to read a place, its stone, its climate, its appetite for looking older than it was. He studied for a stretch at Boone's College in Berkeley, though the record of what he actually absorbed there is thin. What is certain is the apprenticeship that followed. Between 1894 and 1897, he worked under Willis Jefferson Polk, one of San Francisco's most respected architects, tracing lines in a drafting office that shaped some of the city's most admired buildings. There was no examination waiting at the end of those 3 years, no board to certify him, no license bearing his name. There was only what he could absorb, standing over another man's table, watching a working architect turn a client's demands into a set of drawings, and taking whatever of that skill his eye was quick enough to catch. It was the nearest he would ever come to formal training, learning a craft by watching it practiced rather than by earning the paper that certified it. Then, with that apprenticeship behind him and a career in architecture his for the taking, he did not open an office. He went north instead, to the Yukon, chasing the same gold rush that was already pulling thousands of amateur prospectors out of San Francisco in 1898, on the strength of rumor alone. He spent 2 seasons working the frozen creek beds of the Klondike, staking claims on ground that might or might not hold what the maps and the rumors promised. It was a wager on land, sight unseen, made on the strength of someone else's story about what lay underneath it, and it was not the last time in his life he would make that exact bet, or the last time he would sell that same wager to somebody else. Whatever fortune he went looking for in the Yukon, it never found him. He came home with the same empty hands he had left with, and with a habit of chasing ground he had not yet seen fully formed. By any accounting, there was still no finished building to his name, and no architecture license of any kind. None of it, not Guatemala, not China, not the drafting table under Polk, not the frozen ground of the Klondike, amounted to a professional credential by any standard the profession recognized. And yet, within 2 decades, this man with no architecture degree would become the leading architect in Florida, the man who decided what an entire coastline was supposed to look like. The years after the Yukon are the quiet years, the ones no headline was written about. He drifted through them the way he had drifted through Guatemala and China, a man good with people and short on direction, his prospects no clearer at 30 than they had been at 17. But somewhere in those quiet years, his own health began to fail him, and that failure, not any building, not any apprenticeship, was the thing that would finally put an architecture career in his hands. A collapse was coming, one that would leave him too weak to work and in need of a warmer climate than California could offer. He did not know it yet, but the man who would carry him south, and the coastline he would carry him to, were about to change what an untrained draftsman from Benicia could become. Chapter 2. The invalid Paris Singer carried south. The coastline that was about to remake him belonged, that winter of 1918, to a friend Mizner had made somewhere in the drifting years New York had swallowed whole, a man named Paris Singer. Singer was heir to the Singer sewing machine fortune, rich enough that he had never needed to work a day of his adult life, and restless enough that he collected unfinished, interesting men the way other wealthy men collected horses. He found Mizner exactly where the last chapter left him, too weak now to keep pretending the collapse was temporary, his body finally presenting the bill for 30 years of prospecting camps and drafting room floors and ocean crossings on nerve alone. New York in winter was no place to recover from anything, and both men seemed to understand that at roughly the same moment. Singer did not send flowers. He proposed a private rail car south to a strip of Florida coast mild enough in January that a sick man might mend simply by lying still in the sun instead of freezing through another New York winter. For Mizner, who owned no finished building and held no license and had nothing left in New York worth staying for, there was no reason to refuse. He boarded that train an invalid, carried by another man's money toward a climate he had done nothing to earn and a coastline he had never designed a single structure for. The country outside the window changed from gray to green as the miles passed, and somewhere in that changing light, a man with no career behind him was being carried toward the only one he would ever have. He arrived on Singer's terms, and by Singer's arrangement, a passenger rather than a professional, and for the first weeks that was exactly what he remained. The Florida sun did what New York apparently could not. Strength returned slowly, the way it does to a body that has spent decades refusing to rest, and with it came the ordinary business of two men with money and time on their hands, sitting out the war news together on a winter porch while younger men fought an ocean away. It was an arrangement built on gratitude and idle generosity, the kind of friendship a rich man extends without thinking, and a sick man is in no position to turn down, and neither man yet knew how far it would carry either of them. But idleness never held Paris Singer for long, and the war would not let it. Word of the wounded coming home, broken in ways no Florida sun alone could mend, reached even a winter resort built for people who had never had to think about the fighting at all. Singer had land on the island and a fortune that had never once been asked to do anything useful. He began to talk, in that winter of recovery, about building something for those men, a place to convalesce the way his own convalescing architect friend was convalescing now. It was, for a man who had spent his life spending rather than building, the nearest thing to a purpose he had ever proposed for himself. He had, sitting beside him on that porch, exactly the kind of man such a project required, and exactly the kind no one else would have hired for it. A man unlicensed and untested, with no completed building anywhere to his name, and, for the first time in his life, with nothing left to lose by trying. What Singer was about to ask him to design would not look like recovery. It would look like a hospital, and by the time it opened, it would not be a hospital at all. Chapter 3. The Hospital That Became a Palace. It would look like a hospital, and for the better part of a year, that was exactly what it was meant to be. Singer had land on the island. Wounded men were coming home from a war fought an ocean away, and he wanted a place built to receive them, a convalescent home where broken bodies could mend the way his own broken architect had mended on that Florida porch. He named it the Touchstone Convalescent Club and gave the commission, without hesitation, to the one man on the property with no license, no completed building, and nothing left to lose. Ground broke in the summer of 1918 on a design unlike anything the island had seen before. Low courtyards instead of the wedding cake porches of the old resort hotels, red tile roofs and whitewashed walls borrowed from a Mediterranean coastline neither man had ever lived on. It was Mizner's first real building, and he was building it for men who might never walk through its doors. The men who actually raised it were masons and plasterers, pulled off other island job sites, working through a Florida summer to hang wet stucco over timber, framing fast enough for a rich man's war charity to open before the war itself decided whether it was needed. None of their names survived attached to the building. Singer's did, and increasingly so did Mizner's. Then the guns in Europe fell silent, and the war that had summoned the building into existence ended before the building itself was finished. The wounded men Singer had built the convalescent home for stopped arriving in the numbers anyone had planned for. A hospital with no patients does not stay a hospital for long, and Singer, who had never in his life let an asset sit idle, did what men of his fortune do when a project outlives its original purpose. He turned it into something else. On the 25th of January, 1919, the building that had been designed to receive the wounded opened its doors instead to Palm Beach's wealthiest, admission by invitation only, membership itself a kind of currency. The Everglades Club, they called it now, and the island's old hotel society, the railroad fortune crowd that had wintered for a generation inside Henry Flagler's grand hotels, found something inside those courtyards it had not known it was missing. Here was a clubhouse that looked as if it had stood for centuries, arcades and loggias, and a bell tower that seemed to have grown out of the ground rather than been built on it, and it had been designed and finished in under 7 months, the first building the man behind it had ever completed in his life. For a generation, Flagler's hotels had been where the island's winter fortunes gathered, long verandas and gilded dining rooms built in the borrowed manner of a New York resort, transplanted whole onto sand. The Everglades Club offered something those hotels never had, walls that pretended to a history the entire state of Florida did not possess. Members strolled courtyards meant to look weathered by centuries neither the building nor the island had lived through, and no one asked too closely how a structure raised in a matter of months had come to look so old. That question, unasked in 1919, would matter a great deal later. The Everglades Club made Mizner. Membership filled, the right names attached themselves to the right rooms, and the architect who had arrived on the island as another man's charity case became, almost overnight, the one name every arriving fortune wanted on its own front door. Singer had built the club and taken the credit a founder takes, but it was Mizner's courtyards the members walked through, Mizner's arches they photographed, Mizner's name that began to travel the dinner tables of a resort built entirely on who built what, for whom. The two men had made each other, business partners now as much as friends, bound together by a club that neither could have built alone. What that partnership would eventually cost the two of them was a question neither had yet thought to ask. Palm Beach's new money did not want a convalescent home reborn as a clubhouse. It wanted the coastline to look like this everywhere, on every lawn a fortune could buy, and it wanted the man who had just proven he could conjure old-world permanence out of raw Florida sand to be the one who built it. A career that had begun as a favor between a sick man and a rich one was no longer anyone's charity. It was a demand, and the demand had a shape nobody in America had yet given a name. Mizner was about to give it one. Chapter 4. The Style He Invented from Nothing. The demand did have a shape after all, and Mizner spent the years that followed giving it one. He called on a Mediterranean coastline he had only glimpsed in passing, and a Spain he had never set foot in. And out of these borrowed geographies he assembled an architecture that had not existed anywhere before him, a manor built to look older than the island it stood on. Red barrel tile roofs sloped over whitewashed walls, the way they did above the Italian coast. Wrought iron balconies, forged to look inherited rather than ordered, hung over courtyards planted to resemble a Seville none of his clients had ever visited. The same restless years that had carried him prospecting through the Yukon and wandering through Guatemala now supplied him raw material no architecture school ever taught, a memory of arches and tiled stairs collected on the move rather than studied in a classroom. In the years ahead, he would put his name on 67 structures on this stretch of coastline alone, then 27 more in a town he had not yet dreamed of building. But no client on the island was really hiring Mizner to build a house. They were paying him for a past, and no contract on the island ever said so in those words. The fortunes wintering on Palm Beach in the years after the Everglades Club opened were, almost without exception, 1 or 2 generations old. Railroads, steel, banking, the American industries that had thrown off more money in 30 years than most old-world titles had accumulated in 300. What that money could not buy on its own was the one thing it wanted most, the look of having always belonged somewhere. A new fortune inside a new house looks exactly like what it is. A new fortune inside a courtyard built to look weathered by centuries looks, to a guest not inclined to inspect the mortar, like an old one. Mizner had already proven at the Everglades Club that he could manufacture that look faster than anyone on the island thought possible. A clubhouse raised in under 7 months that photographed as though it had stood since the Spanish crown still claimed the peninsula. Word of the trick moved through Palm Beach the way word of a discreet doctor or a trustworthy broker moved quietly from one fortune to the next, until the architect who had arrived with no diploma and no finished building to his name could no longer take every commission offered to him. He did not design within a style so much as assemble one, an arch borrowed from one century set beside a tower borrowed from another, and the assembling itself became the whole of his invention. He worked from sketches made on site, adjusting a roofline while the masons were already laying stone beneath it, building as though the plans were being remembered rather than drawn. His clients did not ask where the memory came from. Palm Beach had already decided, back at the clubhouse finished in 7 months, that already looked as though it had survived several wars, that it preferred not knowing the answer. A hotel room had been a fortune's winter address for a generation, a season rented inside someone else's design, a place at another man's long veranda alongside every other fortune wintering the same week. A private courtyard built in Mizner's manner was proof of something a rented room could never offer, that a family belonged on this island in its own right and needed no innkeeper's roof over its head. Once one fortune commissioned that proof, the fortune wintering next door wanted the same proof for itself, and the fortune beyond that, one wanted it more grandly still, until an architect's private sketchbook had become the one common language a very uncompromising set of neighbors could agree to speak. What none of them fully understood, Mizner included, was what he was actually selling. It was never really the stone or the tile. It was the confidence that comes from walking through a gate and looking to every guest who passes through it like a family that has never once had to explain itself. A style invented from nothing had become the only style the island's new money wanted to be seen in, and the demand for it was already outrunning what one architect, working from memory and borrowed geography, could build with his own two hands. The society that had learned not to ask how a young building got old so fast was about to find out how far a man willing to manufacture that age could take the manufacturing itself. Chapter 5. How to Build a Ruin on Purpose. The manufacturing was not a figure of speech. Behind the courtyards and the wrought-iron balconies that photographed as though they had survived 3 centuries of weather, Mizner had built an actual factory, a working plant of casting sheds and drying yards where cast stone came off molds shaped to look like something a quarryman had cut 200 years earlier. He called it Mizner Industries, and by the year 1925 it had grown into one of the largest manufacturing operations in the county, though almost nobody who admired what it produced had ever seen the building where it was made. The process itself had a kind of blunt honesty most of its customers never learned. Limestone, granite, and marble were machined rather than carved, poured and shaped by workers trained to reproduce the uneven strike of a chisel that no chisel on the premises had actually swung. Once a piece came out of its mold looking new, which is to say looking exactly like what it was, it moved on to a second set of hands for the trick's other half. Sandblasting cut into the surface the way a century of salt wind might have. Stain worked into the wounds the blasting left behind, the way age works its way into stone, left standing too long in weather, it was never built to survive. Furniture came off the same logic. Chairs and cabinets finished that same week were nicked, scraped, and worn down by hand until they looked inherited rather than delivered from a workshop down the road. A dining table could leave the shop on a Tuesday morning looking as though it had already outlived the family that ordered it. The plant did not run as a single trick performed once and hidden away. It ran as a production line, one that treated the appearance of age the same way any other Florida manufacturer of the period treated brick or roofing tin, as an output measured in units and shipped on a schedule. Wagons and later trucks carried the finished stone out through the same gates every week, bound for a courtyard or a garden wall that would be photographed within the year as though it had stood since before the county existed. The men who mixed the stain and ran the sandblast hoses knew exactly how new their work was. The families who later stood beneath it did not ask, and the factory had been built, in part, on the confidence that they never would. None of it was hidden exactly. Mizner said as much himself, in a line that survived him. He wanted, he said, to make a building look traditional, as though it had fought its way from a small, unimportant structure to a great rambling house. It was a fight the building had never had to fight, a history it had never had to survive. He was not describing a deception so much as a specification, the way an architect specifies a roof pitch or a wall thickness, except the material he was specifying here was time itself. The one thing no fortune on the island could otherwise buy at any price, no matter how new or how large. That was the quiet joke sitting underneath every commission, the one Mizner seemed content to let his clients miss. A courtyard finished the previous spring looked, by the time the sandblasting crew had left it, older than families who had wintered on the island for 2 full generations. The casting shed, holding half-finished stone, still tacky from its mold, sat less than a mile from a drawing room where a guest ran an appreciative hand along a weathered archway and complimented its age. Both impressions were, in their way, honest. The archway had weathered. It had simply done its weathering that spring, under a hose and a stain rag. rather than across the centuries its surface implied. Demand did not slow down for any of this. It accelerated because Mizner now controlled the one operation on the island capable of manufacturing the single thing new money wanted most and could not otherwise purchase, and every fortune that watched a neighbor take delivery of an instant ruin wanted a delivery of its own. What had begun as one architect's private workshop, built to finish his own commissions faster than an honest quarry could supply him, had become the boom's own supplier, cast stone and forged iron and distressed wood moving out through its gates faster than any foundry keeping honest time could ever have matched. The factory had proven something the rest of the story turns on. Mizner had shown to himself, if to no one else, that history could be manufactured on a schedule, cast in batches, and sold at a price a buyer would gladly pay precisely because it looked like the one thing money alone was not supposed to be able to purchase. A courtyard was a small commission to age this way. A man who had learned to build a ruin on purpose and had already found an island willing to pay for the privilege was not going to stop at courtyards. He was already looking past the private gates at the avenue running through the middle of the island, the one street where his factory's manufactured age would have to convince not one client's dinner guests behind a locked courtyard door, but every visitor who walked its storefronts in daylight. Chapter 6. The Street He Built for the Rich. Worth Avenue ran a few short blocks between the ocean and the lake, and it was here that Mizner's manufactured age would have to survive its hardest test yet, judged in daylight by strangers who paid nothing for the privilege of looking. A courtyard behind a locked gate could fool a dinner guest who wanted to be fooled. A public street could not choose its audience, and Mizner built one anyway. He laid the avenue out the way he laid out everything else, as a sequence of surprises rather than a straight commercial corridor. Arcades opened without warning into hidden courtyards. A shopper following the sidewalk past one storefront window would find herself, a few steps later, standing under a loggia with no destination but the next unexpected turn. The narrowest of these passages he named Via Mizner, a mews barely wide enough for two people walking abreast, lined with the same cast stone and the same weathered iron his factory had been shipping out by the wagon load since the courtyards of El Mirasol and Playa Riente. Here, the manufactured age did its public work. Shop after shop wore a facade built to look as though the building had stood on that spot since before the avenue existed, when, in some cases, the mortar had not yet finished curing. Mizner kept an apartment for himself above the shops on Via Mizner, a perch from which he could watch his own street being discovered by the people it had been built for. He filled it, as he filled most rooms he lived in, with more company than a bachelor strictly needed. Among the residents was a spider monkey he had named Johnny Brown, known around the avenue as the human monkey, who kept the run of the balconies and the awnings above the arcades, and became, to the shopkeepers and the wintering families alike, as recognizable a fixture of Worth Avenue as any of the buildings Mizner had designed to stand beneath him. Visitors who came to look at wrought iron and hand-worked stone left, more often than not, talking about the monkey instead. It was a small detail, and Mizner seems to have understood exactly what it was worth. An avenue built entirely from calculated appearances needed one uncalculated thing in it, something simply alive rather than manufactured to look old, and a monkey on a balcony rail did more to soften the whole engineered street than any courtyard could. The wealth that wintered in Palm Beach wanted to believe it had wandered into an old world by accident, not paid an architect to construct one, and a familiar animal greeting them from a shop awning did that work better than stone ever could on its own. By the middle of the decade, Worth Avenue had become the fixed address of Palm Beach's fashionable season, the street where a fortune went to be seen spending itself. Motor cars idled at the curb outside boutiques that had not existed 5 years earlier. The same families who wintered behind the Everglades Club's guarded lawn now walked Mizner's arcades in daylight, past his aged stone and his climbing bougainvillea, buying into an illusion of permanence, one storefront lease at a time. What Mizner had proven inside private courtyards, he had now proven on a public street lined with paying tenants, and the proof was a kind of currency in itself. Every landlord on the island wanted a version of what Via Mizner already had, but an avenue of shops, however profitable, was still bound by the size of the island it sat on, and Mizner had already begun looking south, past the causeway, toward open scrubland that no one had yet decided was worth anything at all. Worth Avenue had taught him that people would pay for the appearance of an old world built yesterday. Something far larger than an avenue of storefronts was about to test whether they would pay for a city that did not exist at all, a fever already moving up the coast of Florida that would reach Mizner's door before the next season began. Chapter 7. The Fever That Took Florida. The fever moving up the coast had a name by the middle of the decade, and it had nothing to do with architecture. It was land, and by 1925 it had taken hold of Florida the way a rumor takes hold of a crowded room, spreading faster than anyone could verify it, and believed most fiercely by the people standing farthest from the ground being sold. The mechanism was simple enough that a stranger off a train could learn it before he had found a hotel room. A buyer put down a small deposit against the full price and received in exchange a binder, a slip of paper promising a purchase still weeks or months from closing. He did not need to hold that binder for even a single afternoon. He could sell it on the sidewalk outside the sales office, in a hotel lobby in Miami, on a railroad platform in West Palm Beach, to the next man off the next train, and pocket the difference before the balance on the original contract ever came due. The men who worked this trade in numbers became known, without much affection, as Binder Boys, and by the middle of the decade, whole blocks of downtown Miami were said to be worked by little else. A single acre of scrub could change hands again and again in the course of one afternoon, each buyer paying more than the last for a piece of ground none of them had walked. The money, overwhelmingly, came from somewhere else entirely. Trains from Ohio and Pennsylvania and New York arrived thick with buyers who had never set foot in the state before, carrying brochures mailed to them that winter, rendered in ink far more finished than the land itself. A subdivision advertised as a coming resort city might still be standing water and pine scrub and mangrove root, waiting on a dredge that had not yet arrived, but the buyer up north did not need to see it to believe in it. He needed only the drawing, the price climbing on the page, and the certainty, repeated at every dinner table and every barber shop from Cleveland to Scranton, that Florida land only went one direction. It was a faith bought sight unseen and sold the same way, on paper, for paper, by men who mostly never intended to build anything at all. Palm Beach and its neighboring coastline sat inside this fever, not above it. The very appetite Mizner had spent 7 years cultivating, the hunger of new American money for the appearance of an old and settled world, had helped teach an entire region that a picture and a promise were worth paying for in advance. He had built that lesson one courtyard at a time, in cast stone weathered to look older than the mortar underneath it. Now the lesson had escaped the island and multiplied itself down the coast in a currency he had not invented but understood better than almost anyone selling it: appearance, sold ahead of substance, and settled later, if ever. Not every voice in the state believed the fever would hold. Bankers up north wrote cautious letters about paper wealth built on nothing but resale, and a few Florida newspapermen, watching prices double on land that had changed nothing but its ownership, allowed themselves the occasional dry warning about a market that manufactured value by rumor alone. Nobody selling binders in a Miami hotel lobby had time to read them. The trains kept arriving, the brochures kept multiplying, and the state's politicians, flush with the tax receipts a booming land market threw off, saw little reason to ask a boom this profitable to explain itself. He had watched the fever build from Worth Avenue's arcades for 2 seasons, an architect with a full order book and no need, on paper, to risk anything further. But an avenue of shops had a ceiling, however profitable, and a man who had already proven that people would pay to believe in a courtyard built yesterday was unlikely to stand at the edge of an entire undeveloped coastline and feel nothing. South of the island lay open scrubland that no one had yet decided was worth a fortune, empty of binder boys, empty of trains, unloading buyers, empty of anything but pine and palmetto and 2 miles of untouched Atlantic shore. That emptiness would not last the year. The fever that had turned Miami sidewalks into trading floors was already moving north along the coast road, and the man who understood better than any developer alive how to sell an illusion of permanence was standing directly in its path, with a brother waiting in the wings who understood something else about selling entirely, and a syndicate of famous names about to put their signatures beside his on paper. Neither of them had any intention of leaving unsold. Chapter 8. The Syndicate of Famous Names. The brother who came south that year had never set a stone or drafted a blueprint in his life, and he had no intention of starting now. Wilson Mizner arrived at Addison's side not as an architect, but as something the venture had not yet possessed, a gambler, a wit, and a Broadway playwright who had already proven, with a melodrama that filled a New York house in 1910, that he knew exactly how long to hold an audience before he asked them for something. The 2 brothers had grown up under the same roof and gone looking for a fortune by opposite roads ever since, one chasing gold in the Yukon and stone in Palm Beach, the other working card tables and stage doors from San Francisco to Broadway, and now, for the first time since either of them had left home, they were about to work the same deal. Addison had spent 7 years teaching Palm Beach to pay for the appearance of an old world built the week before. Wilson had spent 3 decades learning that a stranger would pay just as readily for the promise of a world he had never seen at all, and would often pay faster for the promise than for the thing itself. Between the 2 of them, the operation now had every tool an illusion required, one brother to manufacture the look of permanence, and the other to make strangers want to own it. In 1925, the 2 brothers incorporated the Mizner Development Corporation, and the filing itself was the least interesting document in the file. What mattered sat beneath it on the signature page. T. Coleman DuPont put his name there first, carrying the weight of a family fortune built on chemicals and gunpowder. Irving Berlin signed next, the songwriter whose tunes were still playing in the ballrooms the northern buyers had just left behind. Elizabeth Arden followed, a woman who had built her own empire, proving that appearance itself could be bottled and sold to strangers by mail. William K. Vanderbilt and his brother Harold added a name that had financed half of Gilded Age America. Its own fortune raised on rail lines laid across ground its owners had likewise never walked. Rodman Wanamaker II, heir to a department store fortune built on the promise that a catalog picture and the real object were the same thing, signed beside them. The Duchess of Sutherland added an English title to the letterhead, a shine no American dollar alone could buy. Clarence H. Geist put his name to the page as well, a name that meant little to the public that winter, and would mean a great deal more before this story was finished. And Paris Singer signed last, the same man who had carried Addison south on a stretcher 7 years earlier, staking his faith in the architect a second time, now on a city that existed nowhere but a survey map and a set of drawings. Behind those signatures stood the ground itself, 1,600 acres, stretching across roughly 2 miles of open Atlantic oceanfront, most of it still scrub pine and palmetto, and unbroken shoreline that no dredge had yet touched. It was, on paper, the largest single holding either brother had ever put a name to, and not one lot of it had a house standing on it, a road running through it, or a canal cut into it. The corporation owned sand, water, and a set of blueprints, and against that it now had the signatures of 9 of the most recognized names in America. What the corporation held, in truth, was not land so much as leverage, a roster of backers whose names alone were worth advertising before a single lot was platted, a coastline already recognized from Cleveland to Scranton as the place where new money went to look old, and a brother who could sell an acre of unbroken scrub pine as confidently as he had once sold a seat at a Broadway premiere. Addison's eye had already convinced Palm Beach to believe in invented history, and Wilson had the nerve to ask total strangers who had never walked the ground in question to buy a piece of it sight unseen, along with the showman's instinct for knowing exactly which names to put in front of them first. It was, underneath the incorporation papers and the famous signatures, the same transaction the state's binder boys were already running on a street corner in Miami, dressed now in formal letterhead and run by men who had never had to hustle a stranger for a deposit in their lives. It was about to be run at a scale the binder trade had never attempted, on ground far more valuable than anything changing hands in a hotel lobby. The corporation was formed, the backers were signed, the ground was bought and not yet touched. What the venture needed now was buyers by the thousand, and the machine 2 very different brothers had just assembled to find them was about to go to work. Chapter 9. He sold a city that did not exist. The trains began arriving before the canal did, and the men and women who stepped off them at Boca Raton that season did not come to see scrub pine and survey stakes. They came to see the city the drawings had already promised them, a Mediterranean water capital risen whole from the Florida coast, a grand canal running the length of a boulevard the corporation had renamed before a single yard of it was paved, gondolas gliding beneath striped awnings toward a shoreline that had not yet been touched by a single dredge. El Camino Real was the name on the plat, but the sales office called it something grander. The Royal Highway, the brochures read, and beneath that line, printed on every pamphlet mailed north that winter, sat the phrase, "Wilson Mizner's sales floor had settled on, and never once revised." The world's most architecturally beautiful playground. Nothing behind that phrase existed yet. The canal was a pencil line on a rendering. The gondolas were an artist's flourish, sketched onto water that was still open scrub. The playground was a promise sold in advance of the ground it was promised on. The rendering did the work an unfinished shoreline could not. It showed a canal already full of water, gondolas already loaded with passengers, a boulevard already lined with the Mediterranean facades Addison had spent 7 years teaching Palm Beach to want. Nothing in that picture had been dredged, poured, or planted, and the brochure carrying it never said so, because the brochure was not describing the ground. It was describing the ground's finished future, priced and sold as though the future had already arrived. None of that slowed the buyers for a single afternoon. On the first day the sales pavilion opened its doors, the corporation took in more than $2 million for lots that were still sand and palmetto. A second offering, staged only weeks later, brought in another $2 million. By October the ledger read $25 million sold across the 1,600 acres and 2 miles of oceanfront the brothers had assembled the year before, and nearly all of that fortune existed as paper, installment contracts signed by buyers who put down a fraction in cash and promised the balance years into a future none of them could see. They signed from cities they had never left, buying ground they had never walked, trusting a corporation whose letterhead carried the names of Irving Berlin and Elizabeth Arden and a DuPont, men and women whose fame did the work no surveyor's report could have done. A buyer in Cleveland did not need to see Boca Raton. He needed only the drawing of the canal, the roster of famous signatures above his own, and the same faith already moving up the coast that Florida land climbed in only one direction. Wilson had spent 30 years learning exactly how long to let an audience believe before he asked them for something, and he had never had an audience this large or this far from the thing he was selling. There is a piece of this story worth pausing on before the water in that canal ever exists. This channel exists to keep pulling stories like this one out of the record, the architects and promoters who built entire American landscapes on invention and staked their names on illusions that outran them. If that is the kind of history worth following, subscribing is what keeps this channel finding the next one. Behind the brochures, the machine kept running exactly as the two brothers had built it. Addison's drawings supplied the vision, a coastline reimagined as something older and grander than it had ever been. Wilson's showmanship supplied the urgency, the sense that a buyer who waited even a week would pay more for a worse lot. Between them, the corporation sold $25 million of a city that had not yet laid a foot of canal, poured a foundation, or floated a single gondola on open water, and the money kept arriving faster than any crew could have built against it, even if building had been the point. It was not yet entirely a lie. A city could still rise behind a sold-out ledger if the builders moved quickly enough and the buyers stayed patient long enough for the concrete to catch up to the contracts. Somewhere on the grounds the corporation had bought, a single structure was in fact rising out of the sand that winter, real stone and real timber, and a real foundation poured into real ground, the one piece of the promised city that construction crews were actually building rather than merely rendering. Of everything drawn on that canal-side plan, that was the only building far enough along to open its doors to a guest, and what happened when it finally did would decide how much of the rest of the promise anyone would ever get to collect on. Chapter 10. The one building that was real. A guest could walk through it, and that was the whole difference between this one structure and everything else the corporation had sold that year. On the 6th of February, 1926, the doors of the Ritz-Carlton Cloister Inn opened onto real stone and real timber rather than a rendering. 100 rooms furnished at a reported cost of nearly $10,000 each, a sum that alone would have covered several of the modest frame houses still rising slowly along the unfinished lots just beyond its gates. The Ritz-Carlton name over the entrance was not a boast the corporation had coined for a brochure. It was borrowed from a hotel company whose reputation had been built for decades in cities that had never heard the name Boca Raton, lent now to the one building in the whole development that could actually be checked into. Mizner had designed it himself in the same Mediterranean vocabulary he had spent 7 years teaching Palm Beach to want. Barrel-tile roofs, deep arcaded loggias, a courtyard built to look as though the sea had been arriving at that door for 300 years rather than 3. He had built his career on the stated aim of making a structure look as though it had fought its way from a small, unimportant structure to a great rambling house, and every room of the Cloister Inn carried that manufactured age, furniture distressed by hand to look older than the men who had built it. But here, for once, only the age needed inventing. The building underneath it was not a fake at all. It was finished, it was standing, and a guest could sleep inside it that same February night. That was the danger in it. Every guest who signed the register at the Cloister Inn that winter walked out having touched something real and carried that conviction back into the sales pavilion where the rest of Boca Raton still waited on survey stakes and pencil lines. The hotel did not merely house the corporation's best customers, it vouched for the $25 million in unpaid paper sitting behind it, 100 genuine rooms standing surety for a city of thousands that had not yet been poured. A buyer who had dined under the Cloister Inn's arcades did not ask why the Grand Canal 3 streets over was still open scrub. He had already seen, with his own eyes, what a Mizner promise looked like once it was kept, and the sales staff never had to argue the point twice. They simply walked a prospective buyer through the lobby, let the tile and the timber do the talking, and led him back outside toward a plat map of streets that existed nowhere but on that same table. Behind that single hotel, the rest of the arithmetic had begun to strain. Every load of cement, every beam of Dade County pine, every crate of the imported tile Mizner favored for a roofline had to travel south on the same rail lines, now carrying tens of thousands of new Florida buyers into a state whose freight yards had not been built for either. The Cloister Inn had gone up fast enough to open on schedule in a season when speed was still possible. What it would take to build the rest of the promised city behind it, at the pace the ledger already owed buyers in writing, was a question the corporation had not yet been forced to answer. It would not go unanswered much longer. Even as the register filled that February with guests who left believing they had seen the future of the coast, the same railroads that had carried them south had already begun to seize up under a weight the whole boom had placed on them at once. Chapter 11. The tide began to turn. The seizing along the rail lines south of Jacksonville did not resolve itself that winter. It compounded. Through the back half of 1925, the freight cars carrying the cement, the tile, and the Dade County pine that a promised city required began arriving later. Then, barely at all, stacked instead in switching yards from Jacksonville to West Palm Beach, faster than any siding could clear them. The single track that had carried tens of thousands of new buyers south by the trainload was the same track now needed to carry the lumber to house them, and there was room on it for only one of those cargoes at a time. Boca Raton's Grand Canal remained open scrub. El Camino Real remained a road on a rendering. A buyer who had signed a contract that spring, expecting a finished lot by autumn, was now waiting on a delivery the railroad itself could not name a date for. The corporation had sold the future faster than the coast could be built to meet it, and the freight congestion was that arithmetic coming due in the plainest form it could take. A stalled boxcar where a foundation was supposed to be. The newspapers that had spent the boom's opening years running full-page renderings of gondolas and Spanish towers began, quietly at first, to run something beside them. A shipment delayed, a road still unfinished past the survey stakes. A buyer, somewhere, who had stopped paying on a lot he had never once seen built. None of it was scandal. It did not need to be. A market built entirely on the promise that tomorrow's lot would be worth more than today's asking price required only a pause in that promise to start working in reverse, and by the winter of 1925 into 1926, the pause had arrived. Buyers who had paid the first installment on faith and the second on momentum began missing the third. Mizner and his brother had built the machine to run on the arithmetic of confidence, not construction. $2 million taken in on the first day, another $2 million at the second offering, and $25 million by October, on the understanding that the actual city would catch up behind the paper before anyone thought to ask where it was. That arithmetic had worked exactly as designed for as long as the freight kept moving and the buyers kept believing the wait was temporary. It could not survive very many of them deciding, at the same time, that it was not. The men who had lent their names to the syndicate, Pont and Berlin and Wanamaker and the rest, had lent them to a certainty. A certainty, once it develops a public doubt, does not repair itself with another advertisement. Through the early months of 1926, the corporation kept selling, kept photographing the one hotel that had actually opened its doors as proof the rest of it was coming. But a finished lobby only carries a buyer so far past a stalled boxcar and a canal still full of scrub. And for the first time since the sales pavilion had opened, the installment paper behind Boca Raton was coming due faster than it was being renewed. None of it, on its own, would have been enough to end the corporation. Florida had weathered rumors before, and the Coast Mizner had spent 7 years teaching wealthy Americans to want, was not going to lose its appeal because a shipment sat idle in a Jacksonville rail yard. Buyers who missed a third installment could still be talked into a fourth. Newspapers that turned skeptical could still be won back with a good season. What the corporation could not talk its way past was already forming, at that same hour, several hundred miles out over open water, building toward a coast that had never yet been tested by anything larger than a rumor. The tide had turned. The storm had not yet broken. Chapter 12. The Storm That Sealed the Ruin. The storm that had been gathering for days out over open water came ashore on the Florida coast in September of 1926, and it did not pause to distinguish between the one hotel that had actually been finished and the miles of survey stakes still waiting on a canal that had never been dug. Wind tore roofing off buildings that had been advertised only months earlier as the opening chapter of a Mediterranean city rising out of scrub pine. The Grand Canal along El Camino Real, which had never once carried a gondola, filled instead with stormwater and broken lumber. What the freight congestion had only delayed, the wind and the tide now settled in a single night. A buyer who had already stopped believing the third installment would ever buy him a finished lot did not need much persuading to stop paying the fourth. The storm had handed a collapsing market the one thing it could not survive being handed: proof. The corporation that had taken in $25 million on the promise that Boca Raton's future was arriving on schedule now had a flattened sales pavilion and an unfinished canal to point to, and no argument left that the wait had only ever been about freight cars on a single track. The paper had never been money in the true sense, only the promise of money still to come, and a promise does not survive its buyers deciding all at once that it will not be kept. Through the winter that followed, the installment payments that had financed the entire operation slowed to almost nothing. Newspapers that had run full-page renderings of gondolas 2 years earlier now ran notices of a different kind. By 1927, the Mizner Development Corporation, the same company that had once taken in $2 million in a single day, was in receivership, its debts far outrunning what remained of the land, the half-dug canal, and the one-finished hotel left to cover them. The men who had lent their names to the letterhead learned what a signature is: worth, once the venture beneath it, fails. T. Coleman DuPont, Irving Berlin, the Vanderbilt brothers, Rodman Wanamaker, the Duchess of Sutherland, Paris. Singer, each of them had staked money and reputation on a coastline that was supposed to sell itself, and none of it could hold a canal full of storm water together once the buyers stopped paying. A court-appointed receiver now walked the same 1,600 acres the syndicate had once toured with a rendering of gondolas in hand, cataloging instead a sales pavilion with a torn roof, a road graded and never paved, and a canal bed that held rainwater where it was meant to hold boats. None of the celebrity money attached to the letterhead was coming back to finish it. The company that had sold $25 million in lots in a single season was bought, when the receivership finally closed it out, by the one member of the original syndicate who still had capital left to spend. Clarence Geist paid $71,500 in cash for what remained, and took on the assumption of roughly $7 million in debt the corporation could no longer pay. $2 million had once arrived in a single day. $71,500 was now enough to buy the whole of what that day had built. Addison Mizner had designed 67 buildings in Palm Beach and 27 more in Boca Raton by then, had invented an entire architectural language for a coast that had none, and had spent 7 years teaching the richest families in America to want it. None of that craft was in dispute the day the receivership papers were filed, and no auditor going through the corporation's books that winter found a figure that had been faked the way the antique stonework had been faked. The paper losses were real losses, owed to real people, on a scheme that had genuinely intended to finish what it sold. What the record has never fully settled is which man built the wreck that Geist bought for less than the price of a single Palm Beach villa. One reading makes him a visionary artist, undone by a real estate market he trusted further than any market deserves to be trusted. The other makes him a promoter who understood exactly what he was selling, and simply got caught inside a bubble he had spent 2 years helping to inflate. The evidence supports both at once, and the storm that closed the argument never settled between them. It only ended how much longer he could go on being asked to be both at the same time. Mizner Industries, the cast stone works that had manufactured the fake antiquity behind almost every one of those buildings, kept its furnaces running past the corporation's collapse. Addison himself stayed on in Palm Beach, still drawing commissions from clients who could still afford him, a man whose company had failed while his own name, for a little while longer, had not. A continent to the west, his brother Wilson was still working a lunch counter under a hat shaped like a derby, still turning out lines that outran everything he ever built, in a city that had not yet heard what was coming for either of them. What neither brother could see, that winter, was how little time remained to spend it in. Chapter 13, 2 Brothers, Dead in One Spring. The time neither brother had much longer to spend was already running out in the winter of 1933, and neither of them was spending it the way the other's obituary would later suggest. Far from the storm-flattened acreage his own name was still attached to, Wilson Mizner stood most nights behind the lunch counter of the Brown Derby, the round, hat-shaped restaurant on Wilshire Boulevard he had gone in on with a partner, trading lines with the studio men and the actors who came in to be seen being fed. He had never trained as an architect, never drawn a building, never signed a syndicate prospectus that raised $25 million. He had written a Broadway play, The Deep Purple, that ran in 1910, worked the gambling halls of the Klondike and the Barbary Coast before that, and spent the years since selling Florida real estate the same way he had once sold everything else, on nerve and a turn of phrase. At the Brown Derby, the men who ran the studios came to hear him talk the way Palm Beach society had once come to hear his brother's buildings speak for themselves, and Wilson gave them the same performance nightly, a con man's charm with nothing left in Florida for it to sell. The wit that had never built a single one of Addison's 67 Palm Beach houses was, by 1933, the only Mizner asset still earning its keep. In Palm Beach, Addison was earning almost nothing. The commissions had thinned to a trickle since the corporation's collapse, and the man who had invented an entire architectural language for the richest coast in America was, by his final winter, a name clients still recognized and increasingly could not afford. He kept a studio, kept drawing, kept the furnaces at Mizner Industries, turning out cast stone for the few jobs that still came in. Palm Beach itself still filled every winter with the same families who had once hired him, arriving by private rail car for a season inside houses he had built and could no longer afford to build again, the town going on exactly as he had designed it, while its architect went quietly broke inside it. None of it was enough to undo what the receivership had already settled. On the 5th of February, 1933, Addison Mizner died of heart failure in Palm Beach at the age of 60, a ruined man in the town he had taught to want ruins on purpose. The newspapers that covered the funeral had a decade earlier run his renderings of gondolas on the front page. Wilson outlived his older brother by barely 2 months. On the 3rd of April, 1933, in Hollywood, the con man who had helped sell a city that never got built died in the town he had spent his last years selling himself to instead, one line at a time. No syndicate of celebrity names financed his funeral the way one had once financed his brother's canal, and no receiver was ever appointed to sort through what Wilson Mizner left behind, because there was nothing left to sort. The brothers who had shared a syndicate, a scheme, and a name on the same failed letterhead did not share a deathbed or a coast. They shared only a season, the same brief stretch of one American spring, in which both of them ran out of time within 2 months of each other, a continent apart. Both had spent their lives getting people to pay for something manufactured as though it were real, and by that spring both had finally run out of buyers. The company neither of them lived to see finished collapsing did not stop collapsing because they had died. 4 months after Addison was buried, Mizner Industries, the cast stone works that had machined the fake antiquity behind almost every building he ever finished, was itself declared bankrupt. The furnaces that had spent a decade aging new stone to look centuries old went cold for good sometime in the summer of 1933, closing out the last piece of the operation that had ever been entirely his. What remained of the Mizner name by then was not a company, not a bank balance, not even, in Addison's case, a paid-off debt. It was 67 buildings in Palm Beach, 27 more in Boca Raton, a shopping street, a hotel with 100 rooms, and a headstone on Via Mizner belonging not to either brother, but to a spider monkey. Neither Mizner left an estate worth settling. What both of them left, without quite meaning the same legacy by it, was a style of building and a style of talking, one of them constructed in cast stone and sold to millionaires, the other constructed in one-liners and sold to whoever was buying lunch. Only one of those two inheritances would still be standing and still drawing paying guests when the century that buried them both was 3/4 of the way to its own end. Chapter 14. The Illusion That Outlived the Man. The century that buried both Mizner brothers in the spring of 1933 did, in fact, end, and only one of the two inheritances they left behind was still standing to see it. It was not a name on a letterhead or a balance in a bank. It was cast stone, and cast stone does not know when to stop lying about its own age. The 100 rooms Mizner had furnished at $10,000 apiece in the winter of 1926 now sit inside a resort of 1,047 rooms spread across 337 acres, still wearing his red barrel tile and his arched loggias, still called the Boca Raton and still, since 2019, taking paying guests under the ownership of MSD Partners, the investment firm belonging to the technology magnate Michael Dell. The gondolas never came down El Camino Real, and the paper lots never became a Venice. But the one building Mizner actually finished before the money ran out is the one still standing, still profitable, and still carrying his roofline into a second century. Palm Beach kept the rest of him standing, too. Worth Avenue still runs its arcades and hidden courtyards on the exact plan he drew for the carriage trade a century ago, still the street where new money now shops for the genuine antiques his own factory once faked. Via Mizner still carries his name past its storefronts. The Everglades Club, the wartime hospital he converted into the town's first and hardest door to open, is still a private club, closed to almost everyone who asks, exactly as it was the week it opened in 1919. A few miles south, La Guerrida, a house Mizner built in 1923, would later become the Kennedy family's winter White House, the most famous address he ever designed, and one he did not live to see become one. Every winter the town still fills the way it always did, families arriving to spend a season inside houses whose original owners are long gone, most of them never once wondering why the whole coastline looks the way it does, or that the man who taught it to look that way died a few blocks away without the money to build one more of them. None of that permanence belonged to the men who had actually run the sandblasters and the stain vats at Mizner Industries, aging his cast stone and distressing his furniture through the boom years. They never held a share in the Mizner Development Corporation, never sat on a syndicate letterhead beside a Vanderbilt or an Irving Berlin, and their names appear in no history of the buildings their hands finished. What survived was the illusion they were paid to manufacture, not the wages that manufactured it. Mizner had described the aim himself, that a new building should look as though it had fought its way from a small, unimportant structure to a great rambling house. He meant it as a decorator's trick, a sandblaster and a stain bucket doing the work of 100 years. It became something closer to a prophecy. The buildings did fight their way into permanence through hurricanes and recessions and decades of new owners, long after the man who aged them had gone broke and then gone entirely. Not everything he left behind is real estate. On Via Mizner, beside the outdoor tables of a restaurant now doing business on the ground floor of a building he designed, a small headstone still marks the grave of Johnny Brown, the spider monkey known along Worth Avenue as the human monkey, buried in 1927 under one of the only such permissions the town of Palm Beach has ever granted. Tourists still stop to photograph the stone, most of them never told whose grave it is. The architect who built the street around it is barely better remembered a few blocks away. If any of that is familiar, the arcades on Worth Avenue, a night in a room that still carries Mizner's roofline, or a family trade traced back to the workers who built these houses by hand and never made it into the history, subscribe to Empire of Acres. The next family that built an empire on land and lost every acre of it the same way is already waiting. He is gone. The fake he built is still standing, and still a century later doing exactly the job he built it for.